and welcome to another Secrets of the Synth. In today's broadcast, we show you how to actually create tones in the PCMS sound engine. You won't want to miss a thing, so ring the bell, subscribe to the channel, and here's a message from our sponsor. Say hello to Piggy, but don't be a pig yourself. In order for you to replicate the waveforms shown at the end of this video, you're going to have to follow these instructions. Let's come down here and select House Piano. Why are we doing this? You can select any PCMS tone you wish. So just make sure that you select a PCMS tone. Make sure it says PCMS down here. Then you go Shift, Tone Edit. Then you go Tone Utility, Tone Initialize, and select OK. So now you have an initialized tone. There are 3 other conditions you have to do in order to test the waveforms that come with the built-in waves in the PCMS engine. The first thing you will need to do is to go up and across and turn off the filter. You do not wish to have a low-pass filter, even though it is not really engaged. Turn it off because it will affect the purity of your square wave in particular. So you turn off the filters, and the other thing you need to do is to turn off the chorus and reverb, because even in the initialized patch they are also slightly active. So you will come here where it says chorus send level, and you will reduce that to 0. And reverb send level, you will reduce that to 0. Notice we're only dealing with number 1, which has the magenta highlight, because we're only dealing with one voice in demonstrating these waves, even though you have 4 partials with which to play. Alright, the last thing that you need to do before we start selecting waves, you need to plug into your keyboard, if you have not done so already, a hold pedal that allows you to change the polarity. You plug in your hold pedal into where it says hold at the back. You turn on and power up your keyboard, and then you reverse the polarity type. When you touch a note on the keyboard, it will instantly hold forever. We'll actually have to press the hold pedal to stop the note. Once we touch the note, it will go on, and we can make changes to it. And then we're ready to stop the note. We press the hold pedal. And these voices, there's over 1,000 voices in the internal A wave group, which is the only wave group that has these pure waveforms in it. The other waveform, internal B, has mostly percussive voices, and the X3 and X10, which are the wave slots that I have loaded, do not have it. But the internal A, once you get into the 500 region, we are going to find the waves that we want. The JP SAW A, which is at 535, which will be demonstrated in the oscilloscope, where you will hear it at the same time. Then as we move up, we have the JP8 square A at 548, which will be demonstrated just in a minute. Then as we move up, we have The triangle, I use the JD triangle at 563 because it's purer than the plain triangle. And then finally we reach the sine at 564. The pure sine wave that we can get from the PCMS. So when I touch a key, it sounds forever until I press the whole pedal to cancel it. So it's working in the reverse. Normally the whole pedal would extend the sound, but in this case, because I've reversed the polarity of the whole pedal, it is cancelling the sound. Synthesis on the wonderful Roland FA-06. So we exit that one, and once again we press enter, and now what we want to do is we want to find a voice that is an SNS. Any SNS will do. Here we have some SNS voices, so we press enter and select one of those. It says SNS type down here. So once again we go tone edit, and we must remember to initialize the tone. Tone initialize is in the tone utility. Select, initialize the tone, and just as you did if you're testing waves for purity, you want to go and turn off the filter. It always defaults to a low pass filter. Notice now we're only using partial 1. We have 3 partials with which to play, but we're only using partial 1. We come down here and we set the filter mode to bypass. Instead of off, it says bypass in the SNS thing. It doesn't appear that the chorus and reverb affect the oscillator. So you can then come down here and you can start here and you can change your waveforms: saw, square, triangle, and sine. And once again, when you touch a key, it will go on sounding indefinitely until you press your hold pedal. Tone 564 is a perfect sine wave. Tone 563 is a perfect triangle wave. Tone 548, which is labeled JP8 square A, seems to be the best square wave I can find on the PCMS engines. Tone 535, labeled JP8 saw A, is the best sawtooth wave I have been able to find on the PCMS engines. This is the sine wave we get for the SNS Supernatural Synth Virtual Analog Engine. This is the triangle wave that we get for the SNS Virtual Analog Synth Engine. This is the square wave we get for the VA SNS engine. This is the sawtooth wave we get for the SNS Virtual Analog Engine. Now all of these have been on variation A. In terms of the purity of the sine wave, variation B seems to give the purest sine wave. The amplitude for all of the waveforms is less on variation B, and it seems that we don't get that second harmonic bending at the very top. If you go back and look at the variation A of the sine wave, you will see that it's not perfectly symmetrical, that the top seems a little more rounded than the bottom. This may be due to slight overload because of the higher amplitude of the variation A. It may be quite intentional, because it's hard to have variations on a sine wave that don't involve some sort of harmonics. So what I'm saying is that from my test, the variation B seems to have the purest sine wave, if that's what you're really after. For all the other wave shapes, there was no purity involved anyway, and therefore the variation, it didn't make much of a difference in terms of the triangle, and in terms of the other wave shapes, the A version or variation was closest to what you would expect for a perfect wave. I need to add that it doesn't have to be a perfect wave, because we're going to mangle it anyhow with the filters. So therefore, these slight imperfections do not make a noticeable difference in the actual sound as far as your beginning part of synthesis is concerned. You select the wave shape and you go. What you do afterwards with the filter and the envelope generators is going to have the biggest impact. Thus ends the first lesson in getting ready to do synthesis with the wonderful Roland FA-06. Look forward to seeing you in the next video.